We're also live on Facebook, and I believe we can start. It's 101.
Okay.
Here. By the way, Mother's Day is also in Canada today.
Oh, I wasn't sure about that. Thank you. I
Yeah.
never know when you're in sync with the Americans or Dafka not. But yeah, so happy Mother's Day to all the
Oh,
mothers,
and
all the women.
Norbert from France is here.
Oh, Norbert, welcome. We have
And
new Norbert just figured out our new SPNI in France. We had a problem with the tax exempt status there, but Norbert just figured it out. I heard this morning, so thank you, Norbert. And if anybody out there wants to donate through SPNI France, you're welcome to. Appreciate your support in any way. At the end, there'll be a slide that shows how to donate. You can find us online, of course, and but especially we appreciate your support in all ways, especially our boards in the States and in Canada and in the UK and in France, the volunteers who run our friends organizations and support us, the professionals, the few of them, Avi and Michael in Canada and Robin in New York in the United States. Welcome everybody. Welcome to all of you from all over the globe. It's always our pleasure and our privilege to present these webinars every couple of weeks, as we've been doing since early April a year ago. And this we thought would be a timely webinar when we planned it a couple months ago, not realizing it was Mother's Day, of course, until about an hour ago or less. We thought it would be timely because we realized that the Israeli election had been, geez, I don't even remember when it was, in early March, and then it takes about 10 days for the whole process to begin when the president gives a mandate to first it was Bibi Netanyahu. He had a month to try to form a government. He didn't. About a week ago, the mandate to form a government went to Yair Lapid. And I can report up to the minute news, both what's being reported on the airwaves and from what I hear inside from a couple of the MKs and a couple of different parties that I'm acquainted with. People are optimistic. There's going to be a government. Naftali Bennett's going to be prime minister in a government of parity, a unity government of the right, left, and center. You didn't hear it here first, and I'm not signing any guarantees, but that's looking like our best and probably only option other than going to elections again, which would be sometime in the fall if that would happen. That would be 5 times in about 2 years and 4 months. So that would be bad for democracy and bad for everything that I'm about to talk about, because frankly, we in the environmental field, like people in social change fields all over Israel and NGOs, and in the policy planning community in many fields, we feel that we've been stuck on a treadmill for 2 years. Stuck both because without a government, a legitimate government, policy changes and advancing large initiatives are difficult at best, if not impossible, but also because the budgets have been frozen. And when there is no government budget, as there hasn't been for 2 years, that's why this last government fell. When Netanyahu refused to pass the government budget. Because of that, the way it works in Israel is every month you get a 1/12 of the annual budget you last had before the budgets were frozen, and that's been a terrible. It's been a terrible blow to us. We've been expecting some government money for our field schools, and I'll get into that a little bit. But let's get right into the topic at hand here. Current environmental challenge in Israel. Picture from a board trip we did with our American and Canadian boards a couple of years ago, and Educate, Love, Protect on the back of one of our fearless board co-chairs in the United States, Russell. So thank you for that picture. And what I want to say is, before we start about what the challenges are, and it's a recap for most of you, I'm sure, so I'll be quick, and we have a lot to do in the next 40 minutes or so, and then I'll take questions. And Avi, please, if something's not clear or you stop hearing me or something, just interrupt me. And no, I won't be able to tell you the Hebrew names of all the animals, or most of them. Anyway, what's so special about Israel's nature? And you know it's very special, it's very beautiful. Anybody who's been here knows it's beautiful, but it is in fact very, very special. And that is because, among other reasons, that Israel is part of about 3% of the globe declared by the UN a global biodiversity hotspot. That means that per square kilometer, and you can see tiny, tiny Israel in the center of the tiny black circle there on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, that little land bridge is situated between 3 continents. And because of that, we have an extremely high per square kilometer count of almost every kind of species of flora and fauna around the globe. I don't mean every kind of species, but we have in flora and fauna in all the various types of plants and animals and mammals and birds. We have an extraordinary number of species for our size, and it makes us a real important biodiversity hotspot in the world. A lot like, you can see bigger ones and more famous ones like the Amazon or the jungles of Southeast Asia or Central America. But we have a unique topography and climate because we're situated and have animals, the southernmost flora and fauna of Europe, the westernmost of Asia, the northernmost of Africa, makes for a very, very exciting habitat and ecosystem, or series of habitats and ecosystems in Israel. And among the most important aspects of this biodiversity hotspot is the fact that we are on a bird migration bottleneck. And not just any bird migration bottleneck, but the first or second most important bird migration that happens every year, where virtually all except on the very western edge of Europe, virtually all of the birds of the Eurasian landmass that fly south in the fall and then north again in the spring to breed, fly over Israel. They don't like to fly over water. They don't get the currents. So we are the land bridge. And you can see the bottleneck there, right where Israel is in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that means that those birds flying south or flying north have to cross the Sahara Desert, or the Arabian Desert, the vast belt of desert at that part of the world. And it's all the more important that we keep that bird migration flyway a great refueling stop for these birds. Huge populations of birds, tens of thousands of single species of birds who fly together on regular routes. And we know from GPS tracking, sometimes from the same tree in Georgia, Soviet Georgia, or in Siberia, or in Germany, and they rest in the winters in the same tree in South Africa or in Namibia, down in Southern Africa. Fascinating story, the bird migration route. We have a lot to talk about it, but it's just, let's say, and the birds are crucial because they're a sign of and a catalyst for healthy habitats in all of these countries, and all the European and African countries that they hail from and return to, and especially in Israel, where especially our wetland habitats are declining, and we will hear about that more. Just a typical picture, the Hula Valley during migration season. These are common cranes, and tens of thousands of them probably have landed to feed briefly. Sometimes you'll see them storks and in Eilat flamingos sleeping in the water at night where they all land because it's protected in the water, and they take off at once. One takes off, they all take off. Fascinating story. Highly recommend you all come to many places in Israel. From the north to the south, we have fascinating birding centers during any time of the year, really, but especially migration high seasons, which would be, the spring and fall. March and November are the peak. So that's why Israeli biodiversity is so special, and this is where the issues stand today. You've heard a lot of, if you've been watching our webinars, and many of you have been watching our webinars for the last year or so, and following us on Facebook, or reading our emails and communicating with us, so you know a lot of these issues. This is one of the most important facing us right now. It's urgent, and it's not going to be over quick either. For those of you, just to catch everybody up, in February, there was what we called then a devastating oil spill all along Israel's coast. Almost the entire coastline was filled with gooky tar and oil from what apparently was not that big an oil spill, from a pirate ship, and a ship taking illegal, looks like, Libyan tanker taking Iranian oil from the Gulf states, through the Gulf from Iran up into the Mediterranean, and some small leak which washed up on our shore. Wasn't a major leak in terms of the amount of oil spilled. Probably, we still don't know everything about it, but But this highlighted the fact. I mean, we've not only spent a lot of money and time and effort publicly cleaning this up, and some of it will be, some ecosystems and wildlife were damaged irreparably. But what this really signifies is, and is put really into the forefront of debate in Israel, the fact that together with the Abraham Accords, which Israel signed very ceremoniously with the United Arab Emirates and later with Bahrain in last November, I believe, together with those accords of peace and diplomatic exchanges between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, there also was a secret side accords, which we have currently, we and other organizations have sued in the Supreme Court. We did what's called a bagatz, where you can take the government to court for its actions or inactions. And what this semi-secret agreement says is that we can expand, they want us to expand the port facilities in Eilat in order to bring dozens of tankers a year, maybe up to 150 oil tankers a year, to bring oil from the UAE through the Eilat, port of Eilat in the Red Sea. Maybe you can see behind me a little map of the Sinai, and up in that edge of the Gulf of Aqaba is Eilat and the city, Jordanian city of Aqaba. And there is a small port there, and there's an occasional small oil tanker that brings oil to Eilat, and it's sent through aging pipelines that were built when the Shah of Iran and Israel had relations, and we used to be a transit spot for Iranian oil. There's aging pipelines that go from Eilat to Ashkelon, where oil is exported then through the Mediterranean to Europe. And this tiny little operation, which in 2008, there was a spill, which led to a 2008 Marine Readiness Act, which was never been implemented. There was a small spill, and what's just horrendous about this concept of creating a passage for fossil fuel for Israel to be all of a sudden in the Negev, where 358 days a year are sun, to be a fossil fuel pipeline of UAE oil is just, it's horrendous. It's a horrendous environmental thought, made worse by the fact that, as I haven't even mentioned yet, one of the most important coral reefs in the world is just literally meters away from where this port terminal would be built. And the tiniest oil spill could have devastating effects. This particular reef of the Eilat, it's such a hugely beautiful tourist attraction, and something that we're working so hard to save for its natural beauty, and it's what keeps the ecosystem alive. And it's resisted acidification and bleaching like many coral reefs have. It's being studied. It's regeneration around by scientists in Eilat and from around the world. Hugely important to keep it clean and safe. And I could talk about this for 45 minutes, and I'm probably talking about it too long. Anyways, we currently have a Supreme Court case to stop this secret agreement, because just on the procedural level, there was no discussion in the government, and it's such a far-reaching agreement, let alone environmental surveys of potential damage and normal planning procedures. So we're hopeful there'll be at least some sort of stay of execution of this building this port, enlarging the port of Eilat to transfer oil. And that is very connected, excuse me, to another huge marine issue that we have, which is right now it's rearing its head again. Israel, as you know, has become a fossil fuel exporter. We found a decade ago huge reserves, relatively large reserves of natural gas under the seabed in our territorial and economic waters. And those are already producing gas. It's been a huge environmental issue here. I would say on the macro picture, 10 years ago, we in the environmental movement hoped that natural gas was going to be a much cleaner transitional fuel to renewables than of course, the coal that we were then using is, and other kinds of fossil fuel. It's the cleanest of the fossil fuels. But now, 10 years later, with a lot of gas being exported, a lot being used in Israel, we're hoping and praying we're not going to be locked into this natural gas infrastructure for the next couple decades. But we'll see when we look at our climate change goals later in this presentation. we have a lot to worry about. But the last thing we need is new oil and gas exploration in the Mediterranean, which like a hole in the head, as my grandmother would say, we need this. And yet there's talk about and consideration being given now to giving new licenses to explore in Israel's economic waters for gas and oil from the big companies. And we are fighting that tooth and nail. We're preparing a Supreme Court petition for that as well. Related to the sea again, we are trying desperately to enforce fully. Typically in Israel, I mentioned the Marine Preparedness Act of 2008. Had that been funded in 2008 or anytime since, we would have probably had an earlier warning about the oil washing up on Israel's Mediterranean Sea shores in February. That wasn't funded. Now it's being funded and being created. But in 2018, we enacted, SPNI really had fought for a decade to enact fishing regulation to sustainably support the fishing industry. I mean, to create a sustainable fishing industry, regulation that hadn't happened or changed in Israel since the 1950s. And one of the things that has only been partially enforced is the use of trawlers, which are terrible ways to catch fish with a lot of damage to the marine environment and to other marine life. So we're working on that. But the truth is we're working on a lot of marine issues. We have a very active department, and we are just publishing a new report. This should be online in the next day or two. We took, I don't know how many of you have seen Seaspiracy, but I highly recommend it. And it's tough to eat fish after that. It's about the fishing industry and what's happening to our oceans. And even if it's half true, it's shocking even for environmentalists. And so our team working on marine issues sort of looked at what's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean right here in our waters and how we are, in fact, dealing with the various issues of fishing and bycatch and pollution and ghost nets and all of the other various aspects, including even forced labor and slavery, which has popped up here as well. And I won't say any more about it, but it's a fascinating, and it's just an 8 or 10 page report in English, looking at what the issues that Seaspiracy brought up and how we in SPNI and in general Israel are dealing with these issues. So I highly recommend that, and you can be in touch. We'll be sending out, if you're on our mailing list, we'll be sending out links to this. Moving off of the sea, there's a lot we could talk more about the sea. I see we're moving along here in time. I hope I'm not speaking too fast. Other issues facing this current Knesset, I'm going to say a little bit about that in the government that is in the works now, and we hope will be functioning in some way or other. And I'll talk about that maybe at the end as well. I'll get a little more political, but right now to stick with the environmental stuff. You may have noticed if you've been following us for a year, and especially if you're in Israel, you definitely noticed that we have been leading a campaign. We led a campaign last year to ban hunting in Israel. Not many people know that sport hunting is allowed in Israel. There's a season. It runs from September through January. There are, I believe, 8 species or 10 species of animals that can be legally hunted. There's about 2,000 hunters that take out licenses from the Nature and Parks Authority. Most of them are Druze. And what we want to ban hunting altogether. I think it's needless cruelty to animals, and it hurts our habitats, and it's not necessary. That is our position. In the meantime, we don't have the votes. That would require a law to ban hunting, sport hunting in Israel altogether. We're not talking about hunting animals for culling if that has to be done. And yes, we would, the boars in Haifa are an issue, and it's a big issue. If they have to be hunted, they'll be hunted. We're not talking about culling. We're talking about sport hunting. And meanwhile, we did succeed last year is the 2 animals that should be on the endangered species list: the turtle dove and the quail. Turtle dove is the tour mentioned in the Bible, and the quail, they've been put on temporarily. They've been banned on hunting. They're sort of on the semi-endangered species list. We're working to extend that ban to get hunting off the books if possible. And meanwhile, especially because the vultures are being poisoned they feed on carrion that has been illegally poisoned in the Golan Heights. And we're working to greatly increase fines on when we catch poachers, farmers who are or others who are poisoning, using poison as pesticides in the Golan, and therefore killing a lot of vultures, which is a very endangered species. Another big issue facing us, we've been working on this with vigor over the last year. We want to create a rivers authority in Israel. Israeli rivers are in a bad state. They're being overused. And now when desalination is finally coming in and Israel no longer has a water problem per se, the taps are not running dry in Israel. Of course, we have an energy problem because all of that desalination takes so much energy. But what we're saying now is we need to get the water back to nature. We need to rehabilitate rivers, not just keep them clean, but we need to put more water in them, take less water out, and keep more rivers flowing. Crazily, the polluter pays laws that exist in dumping sewage into our oceans doesn't really extend to people polluting our rivers still. It's illegal, but the actual fines based on how much you pollute and stuff, those laws need to be changed, and that's part of our agenda right now in the new government. And by the way, I wrote this just background. I mean, I spoke to several senior figures in SPNI collecting this information, and most important though was Gitit Hirsch, who was our lobbyist in the Knesset, one of our lobbyists. We have others, but Gitit's head of the team and works very closely day and night with MKs from all over the spectrum. So thank you, Gitit, and we will talk a little more about that work in a minute as well. For better or worse, another thing on our agenda is to extend environmental regulations to the civil administration in the territories. This is either obvious and banal, or it's shocking, depending on how you look at it, but the Israeli-occupied West Bank, outside of the borders of the recognized borders of the state of Israel, Israeli law doesn't extend equally over that territory. And one of the things it doesn't and has never extended equally are the same environmental regulations needed in Israel, meaning all kinds of environmental regulations requiring planning processes to take into account things like ecological corridors, or afforestation programs, or especially unique habitats, things like that. So that is also on our agenda. Climate change regulation. I mean, this is a big one, and I could have started with this as well, and it's related, of course, to the whole Israel being a pipeline for fossil fuel. But President Biden had a summit 2 weeks ago that Bibi appeared at with, I think, 70 leaders, including all of the OECD. And Bibi basically fudged the truth about our climate change goals. But let's just say our climate change goals are low. We're not doing our share. We're not committing to what we should be committing to in terms of the community of nations and what we agreed to in the Paris Accords in 2015. The good news for Israel and for the globe is that we're a tiny country, and our whole carbon footprint isn't, the size of a small state in the U.S. But still, it's not a good example. We're not being a good citizen. And there's just a whole lot of reasons, from bureaucratic foot dragging to entrenched interests in the energy and infrastructure ministries. For example, we came to that climate summit a couple of weeks ago with conflicting reports or projections from the energy ministry and the environmental ministry on whether we're going to have 80 or 85% reduction in our carbon emissions by 2050. But Bibi promised 100%, which is what we're supposed to be promising under the Paris Accord. So let's just say our goals are low and they probably won't be met. And one of the questions that's kind of floating around the environmental movement here is what happens if the Biden administration, pressures us? And to what degree is the next administration or future administration is going to double down on that oil and gas exploration, or go ahead with what is so needed and so obvious, which is a breakthrough in solar energy on rooftops all over Israel, on agricultural lands, and wherever we need to get our renewable energy goals up. Right now it's 30% by 2030. We should be at 50%, close to that by 2030, 2040. I mean, we're way behind most states in America in our goals, and we're way behind where we need to be. Wind, by the way, is not a goal. Wind energy we don't think is a very appropriate for Israel, and we can't get much energy from that, and I'll mention that later as well. Other urgent espionage issues we kind of always are keeping an eye on and we're waiting for a government to deal with. One of them is all of the planning issues that we deal with. Really the heart of what we do is land use planning. And a lot of this is not government dependent on a day-to-day basis. It's planning process dependent. Israel has what I guess you call often zoning boards in America, but we have planning committees, statutory committees at the city, at the municipal, the regional, and the national level. SPNI sits on these committees statutorily representing the public, and we try to mitigate unsustainable planning ideas and damage that can happen, and we're trying to create master plans. I wrote Tama here. That's a Tochnit Meitar, master plans for ecological corridors, for forestation in Israel, which I'll mention, and for sustainable planning in the Arab sector and equitable planning, environmental justice, distributive justice in planning, for example, industrial parks and especially in the Arab sector in the Galilee. Another thing that we do regularly, and it's became very important in COVID to get kids out, and schools, of course, have been crazy. They're coming back. It is on our agenda, and we truly believe it is healthy for children to spend overnight school trips out in nature. That's what our field schools do in good years. Every kid from 3rd or 4th grade right up till 11th grade, a couple times a year goes out for 2 or 3 overnights, and so they sleep in field schools. Sometimes they camp under the stars. They learn about local environmental and outdoor issues, history, heritage, and this is, you know, in times of budget constriction, these things are cut back, and with COVID, of course, and we're pushing to get these things back. And as I mentioned before, the government had promised a couple of years ago to be giving us help in a lot of renovation that we need in these field schools that we run to help kids. Field schools are places built Spartan sort of accommodations in nature where man meets nature. It's an interface that kids have and families have on weekends and in the summer at summer camps, and all that stuff is part of the things that we need. We don't so much need a full government, but we need functioning ministers of education and environmental protection to advance these kinds of issues. We are always keeping the finger on the pulse of a few issues I've mentioned before, but going to mention again in a few ways. These issues would include our niche in how we see what we're doing in Israel in terms of climate change. You know, the entire environmental movement in the world, and Israel no less, is pivoting towards framing things and concentrating on climate change. But what we want to do most, in part and parcel of our main mission to protect Israeli biodiversity, we started with that because Israel's incredible flora and fauna, protect and preserve our flora and fauna, and therefore our incredibly unique habitats. We want to enhance these habitats as a way of mitigating the effects of climate change. We see this, for example, in our work in the fisheries industry and marine life. The seas are a huge place that sequesters carbon for the globe, and healthy marine environment is crucial for that. But no less healthy are the wetland habitats that we are trying to create and recreate. And I'll speak about that in a minute. And also the bata, which is, and I'll show you that in a second as well, a scrubland, Mediterranean scrubland, sort of like a grassland or lowly, low vegetation area, which has been unfortunately trampled by a lot of planted forests in Israel. But enhancing Israel's natural habitats is a way to sequester carbon, mitigate the effects of climate change. By part of the ecological rehabilitation of rivers is dealing with their floodplains and their banks, and making sure that their rivers have areas, especially in crazy times. You know, it's not just global warming, it's global weirding. So outbursts. This past winter showed, I think 80% of our rain came in like 4 or 5 separate outbursts of incredible amounts of rain very quickly, and that floods our narrow, shallow riverbeds, and unnecessarily if we build rivers differently, or we help rivers adjust differently. So there's a lot more we could say about that, but another issue that we're keeping our finger on The government is looking at it. It's in the discourse of Israeli society more than it's been for quite a while now, and that's changing the culture of littering in Israel. I'm sure you are all nodding your heads if you've been to Israel and you've seen garbage on the streets of the cities and in nature sites. And if you've ever been to Mitzpeh Ramon, you've probably seen ibex walking around and often eating garbage. And this is a huge issue in Israel, and it has to do with culture change, but it also has to do with infrastructure of the receptacles and how often they're emptied and where they're placed. And it has to do with all the various communities of Israel and the way everybody treats their own sort of public space and the commons. And this is a big multi-year and multi-pronged effort, but SBNI is behind it in many ways, including in our communities volunteering for cleanup issues, but also we've created an app called B'Shvil HaTeva, like for nature or on the path of nature, where we are trying to change behavior. We did this with the organization called Kaima, Dan Ariely's organization, which looks at behavioral science for behavioral change. We're getting people, we have hundreds of nature sites, and you can rate them in terms of cleanliness on a very user-friendly app, and also in terms of how crowded they are, to get people, hopefully to crowdsource people to come to cleaner sites and less crowded sites, but also to create a group of reports in order to pressure authorities, point out to authorities which are the dirtier sites and which need better receptacles or better enforcement or better emptying or policing or regulatory issues. And we have to do this with the various authorities. It could be a municipality, a local council, the JNF Kakal, or the Nature and Parks Authority in all these various nature sites. So that's a huge, big issue. It's on our agenda, and we're working on top-down and bottom-up on this as well. Renewable energy, solar on rooftops is our solar mantra. Before we start taking up valuable open space, we think that there's a lot more to do in terms of solar on rooftops. Fortunately, Startup Nation is all the time working on batteries, on energy storage, and ways to make this stuff more efficient. We reached grid parity globally a while ago, and it seems like, a New York Times article, I think a couple of days ago, said the solar revolution is here. It's not coming, it's here. And there are no market impediments to, creating, especially in Israel. Look, Germany has over 25% of its energy is produced through photovoltaic solar panels, and Germany has average 160 to 180 days of sun a year. We have average 300 to 355 days of sun a year, and we should be doing a lot more in terms of solar energy. Wind energy, on the other hand, Israel is located on that bird migration fly route, as I noted, and windmills are notorious killers, especially of the big birds, which are the most endangered, among the most endangered. They turn very, very slowly, and they have been killing migratory birds in many places in the world, including in Israel. But Israel has there's a small window for wind, as it were, and we're working to keep the wind farms off the migratory bird tracks. And also wind technology, the windmill technology, turbine technology is changing, making them more bird friendly. I know scientists can disagree about this, but that is our policy about wind energy. It's certainly nothing that is being pushed in Israel. I don't think ultimately it's a huge issue in the terms of the fact that we have enough sun to do a lot more before we need to get too deeply into wind energy. Wetland habitat restoration, this is one of the most exciting things, and those of you who follow us, and I think those of you who even people who will follow the news in general will soon be hearing about our new project, which we are calling Startup Nature. These 5 areas of Israel where the circles and ovals are areas of Israel which are filled with fish ponds. You can see a picture of it down in the lower left. This is near Kfar Rupin, at Kfar Rupin in the Beit Sha'an Valley there in the lower right-hand circle, just south of the Kinneret. And these huge numbers of fish ponds, many acres of fish ponds in the dozens of kibbutzim, mostly all over these areas, began in the 20s and 30s already, and they have been providing fish to Israel and for export for a long time. And over the last 20 years, they've begun to decline in their profitability. And that has been a problem because to some degree, if we go back to that bird migration hotspot and the bird migration bottleneck that we were talking about, once the wetland habitats in general in the Galilee, and to some degree fish ponds that were constantly around their edges and at different seasons when there was surplus and they had to get rid of fish, there was a certain substitute for the wetland habitats that were declining. That is becoming very problematic, and the birds that migrate over Israel, that is to say, a large percentage of the bird population of the Eurasian landmass, not to mention Israel's own birds, will be facing a freshwater shortage in the future, and a safe place to land to refuel before flying over the Arabian desert, or to refuel having just flown over the Saharan or the Arabian desert. So we have a vast new program to take unused fish ponds, or fish ponds that the kibbutzim would rather not farm. They're sort of like break-even, economic ventures for them, and turn them over to us with long-term leases. You cannot buy land in Israel this way, but you can lease it for long-term, and basically institute what the Nature Conservancy does on a global level, which is buy land to create private nature reserves in perpetuity. We can't buy the land, but we can lease the land, and we are already engaging in long-term leases with kibbutzim and Kfar Rupin and Magan Michael to convert unused fish farms into biodiversity managed wetland habitats. And when we do that, and we just did that in Kfar Rupin, we reflooded an old fish pond. Nature came back right away. The birds came back right away. And if you've been to the Chula and you know what happened, the story of the Chula, which we can't get into now, but we were very responsible in the. Well, I feel like I have to get into it for a couple of minutes. The Chula. Let's just sum it up and say the Chula wetlands was the Chula wetland has become one of the most important birding hotspots in the world. It's a huge tourist boon to the area as well for Israel, and that's what we want to do. We want to create mini chulas and areas of mini chulas in all of these areas of Israel, which will be for the local kibbutzim both mini tourist attractions for the local population as well. Take your kids out to see birds and on beautiful trails and bird hides, and not just birds, but all the beautiful biodiversity of wetland habitats. So we'll be protecting nature and providing sustainable ecotourism income for these local kibbutzim. And that is a hugely important project we're looking to launch in the coming months, and you'll be hearing more about that. So stay tuned. I think it's world historic because it's never been done in Israel, really. Creating/recreating wetland habitats where they don't exist. Sustainable business practices. We have a very successful program running for, I think, about 8 years now called Teva Biz, where we basically consult to businesses funded by third parties to give them toolkits for nature protection. Not overall sustainability practices, but specifically protecting nature and biodiversity. We work in certain industries like construction, in the wine industry. We have a small capacity at the moment, but always looking to expand it and making important inroads in a sector that most of the environmental movement doesn't really work with very often or very much. I can't end before saying something, as I mentioned before, about our afforestation work or lack thereof. I honestly didn't choose this picture, and I'm not 100% sure what we're looking at, but you can see near the bottom of the valley planted trees, and most of the rest of it looks a lot like scrubland. The bata that I mentioned, it's a unique, like the word maktesh in Hebrew, we say it means crater, but it's actually a unique geological form. There's one in the Ukraine as well. That's according to the geologists. And bata, B-A-T-H-A, is a unique Mediterranean scrubland. It's very rich in biodiversity, and it does actually a lot of carbon sequestration. It tends to be a little green in the winter, but then brown most of the rest of the year, but low scrubland vegetation. And that is the natural land of so much of Israel. And that is the land that so much has been covered by planted forests of the Kakal JNF. And if many of you know this, you've been watching these webinars or seen what we've written about it, but many people are surprised to learn that the JNF has been planting the wrong trees in the wrong habitats in the wrong ways for almost a century now. And of late, they've somewhat acknowledged that and begun to diversify their tree planting. But we are still fighting them tooth and nail on their methods, on their replanting of the forests in the Carmel and the way they do it and how they're doing it, because we don't feel that forests need to be replanted. The seed beds are in the ground, and if the forest is going to regenerate, it's going to regenerate. But what's best for it is to not do a lot. And especially though, when we look at the map of Israel, and to go back to the master plan, the Tama, as we call it, for afforestation in Israel, there's still a lot on that map that, according to the JNF, needs to be filled in with forest. And all of that land is high quality, unique natural habitats, some of it bata, some of it other habitats, but the planted forests, even if they're diverse, are not the answer. They're not the answer to climate change in this area because of the albedo effect. In other words, when you take light brown, or especially they're planting in the deserts, but they're planting, JNF wants to plant in the deserts. We did a Supreme Court case and got JNF to stop planting in the northern Negev, but they're still planting in scrubland areas that are very light in color, and the darker trees basically absorb as much heat as they anyway would sequester. So there's again, their scientists say otherwise, but our scientists don't have an agenda to grind, or they're not trying to do what they've always done as the outsourced forestry branch of the Israeli government. That's an anomaly to outsource forestry to a private body, especially a body like the KKL-JNF that works by law for the Jewish citizens of Israel only. That's why it was created. It's something that should have been abandoned at the creation of the state, but certainly never should have been given the keys to afforestation in Israel, because it is both a real estate development corporation for which that's a conflict of interest, and it doesn't have the professional chops to be doing that. And that is the sad story of Israeli afforestation. The final thing, I'm going to end with some good news and just drill down for a second more about the politics of the situation here. And I see we're 15 minutes, Avi. You don't have to interrupt me. I'll be done in a minute or two. We can ask some questions if there are some. This is a surprise to me. I've been involved in the environmental movement in Israel for decades. And we used to have some lions in the Knesset in the environmental movement. Dov Khanin, a member of the Joint Arab List of Hadash, actually, before it became the Joint Arab List, Jewish member of a primarily Arab party, was a Knesset member probably for over 2 decades, and was a huge environmentalist, a social justice warrior, but environment was one of his deep causes: climate change, migration, and environmental injustices of climate change. Dov retired a couple of years ago. Miki Chaimovich, who was a leading environmental activist in Israel, was in the Knesset briefly for the last couple of years, part of Benny Gantz's party. She resigned. And labor and merits have always had the environmentalists in the Knesset. And when I spoke to the aforementioned VT, we talked about who are her allies in advancing the agenda of SPNI on a day-to-day basis with the members of Knesset. She mentioned labor and merits members that I'm familiar with, of course, and also from the Joint Arab List. But also, and I feel this is new, and I've heard from other people in other parties, that everybody's taking it more seriously now. And in these parties, Yamina, Yesh Atid, Likud, Yisrael Beitenu, Victor Lieberman, and Shas, it's not like there are natural champions of the environment, people for whom it really is one of the subjects that most motivates them. But the leaders of all of these parties assigned an MK or more than one MK to deal with environmental issues in the campaign, and now that they're in the Knesset as well. And it's very interesting to see. And so one of the final things I'll say about it is, so this government that's about to be formed is by definition going to have to focus, and it says it's going to focus only on some very narrow issues of governance and not, touch or avoid like the plague any big ideological issues of religion and state or the territories and things like that. But the question is, where does the environment fit in that? I mean, I think there's a lot of consensus around environmental issues across the board politically in Israel, but a lot of that consensus stuff does clash with issues in other ministries, like interests in energy and in infrastructure. So those are things that we're going to have to keep our finger on the pulse on. We're very optimistic. Final thing I want to mention is that many of you saw at a webinar we had, I believe, over Hanukkah in December with my good friend Yossi Abramowitz. Yossi is a solar power pioneer in Israel and a former candidate for Nobel Peace Prize for his work in Soviet Jewry and in civil rights around the world. But Yossi's been building solar fields first in Israel and now in Africa. And he's running for president of Israel right now. At least he's trying to run. In order to officially run in the Knesset, the president of Israel is a semi-ceremonial position. It does one important thing, which is give the mandate to govern to the person who has the best chance of forming the government after every election. Other than that, fairly ceremonial. Yossi wants to be the green president, a sustainable president. It's a bit of a quixotic journey, but 40 environmental organizations did sign a petition for him in order to run. So the Knesset votes on the president. In order to run officially in the Knesset, you have to have the signatures of 10 MKs. And Yossi doesn't have that yet, but he's working towards it. This is all going to happen sometime in June. But just the fact that a person is running around getting press all over Israel now for trying to be this green, sustainable president of Israel and put a sort of environmental emphasis on the presidency, and this is the common thing that should, keep us together. That to me is inspirational in and of itself. Thomas Friedman has written many times about how, in all kinds of societies, everybody has their interest groups and pulls in their own direction. But truly the common ground that we share is the environment, the air we breathe, the land we live on. And that is the one thing in which all sectors should put aside any differences to focus on and to better. So anyway, that's what Yossi's presidency represents. I see some optimism, and it looks like there's going to be a government in Israel, and they might even tackle some environmental issues in a smart way, and they might even be around for 4 years. So that would be my conclusion tonight. Thank you guys very much. Avi, if there's any questions, we can...
Thank you very much, Jay. Quite interesting, I have to say. And yes, we do have a lot of questions, actually. And let's go right to it.
Stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Okay, so the first two questions are kind of similar, so I'll combine them. Oil is important for transportation, for human consumption. Can SPNI do something to use it safely, and instead of just banning pipelines? And are you working with oil and gas companies to do that?
I assume that was from Alberta, that question, Avi?
I don't know.
I'm joking.
Oh, okay, yeah, from Alberta, right.
Yeah, no. I don't know what, I don't even understand that question. I mean, I'm sure I don't know if there are any safe uses of oil. I can't think of anything. Fossil fuel, I mean, they make plastics, which are incredibly poisonous to our environment every way, and they make cosmetics that nobody wants to use. I mean, I don't even, and certainly it's not, SPNI is not a scientific organization that works with oil companies to make oil safer. We really need to get over fossil fuel. I can't believe I'm saying this in 2021, but we have so many options for powering this globe more efficiently and so much cleaner. And if we're talking fossil fuels, as I've already said, the natural gas is so much safer and cleaner than any oil. Oil should just die where it stays, in the ground, under the seabed. It doesn't need to be moved. And the last place it needs to be moved through is through the port of Eilat and over pipelines into the Mediterranean Sea. But if the concept is, what do I have against pipelines? Yeah, I mean, I don't think that Keystone Pipeline is a good idea. And I don't think letting all the, I don't think it's worth it transporting dirty oil through, pipelines of thousands of kilometers to export to other countries. I just think that we need to rejigger that thing. Certainly in a place like Israel, I mean, where there's no need for
it. Okay, thank you. There was a film called Fantastic Fungi. And the question is, can you use fungi to reduce the harm from oil spills?
I have no idea. I'm not a scientist. I do remember seeing a trailer for that movie, though. Fungi are incredible. And I have a friend who teaches science in New York who's constantly talking about the marvels of fungi. So maybe, but again, we're here to prevent the policies and to develop policies that affect the environment most. I'm not an expert, and SBNI doesn't have experts on cleaning up oil spills or using oil in better ways, or, that's not what we do.
Is it safe to eat fish off the Mediterranean coast? And is there any way of fishing in a sustainable way?
First, is it safe? Yes. There was a ban on eating local fish the Ministry of Health put in right after the oil spill, but rescinded that ban about 2 weeks later. And I have checked that out personally in the past for people. The fish are fine. I mean, is there a way to sustainably fish? There are definitely ways to more sustainably fish. And there are ways to sustainably fish farm as well in the ocean, or especially farm crustaceans, for example, like oysters sustainably. And oyster beds can also be part of a geological solution to keep shores from eroding. But, I really recommend seeing Seaspiracy, because so much of fishing is the bycatch, the accidental problems of fishing. And, fish farming is not a solution in terms of carbon footprint, in terms of gross stuff. Like, a lot of fish farms are fed actual fish that are ground up. I mean, that they fish in the ocean because it's cheaper. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of issues around sustainable fishing. Our bottom recommendation, I just read it in our Seaspiracy document earlier, we recommend reducing meat and reducing fish in your diet. But on the other hand, I have to say, Israel has an incredible culinary scene. And for those who eat fish and meat, I'm not doing any vegan shaming. I eat them. And there's incredible restaurants in Tel Aviv that serve incredible seafood, local and occasionally Mediterranean local. And of course, frozen fish is sold all over the world. And, that's among the least sustainable things to eat, just because it's been transported so much.
All right, thanks. Moving on. Regarding the pipeline, does it affect Jordan? Are they involved, and do you know if they have even a stand on the pipeline?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't think, I mean, are they affected? Yeah, if there was a spill in the Gulf of Aqaba, for those who've been to Eilat, they realize Aqaba and Eilat border each other. The Jordanian shore is, just a kilometer or two from the Israeli shore. So they should be interested in not having, huge oil tankers, dock in the port of Aqaba, right, as much as the port of Eilat.
Okay, still on the Jordan, but this time the Jordan River. Are there any plans to bring back the Jordan River to the Dead Sea? And because the person who asked the question says it's just a shadow of its former self today.
That's very true. It's a non-navigable river, even by a flat-bottom kayak. It's a pathetic shadow of itself. And the answer is halavai. Yes, we hope so, slowly. I mean, first of all, the northern Jordan is coming back. When I talked about river rehabilitation, and I didn't mention, I meant to mention that now that we've desalinating water, it used to be that the national water carrier carried water only from the Sea of Galilee south. Sometimes now we're going to be reversing it to bring water that is desalinated along the coast up to water the ecology of the Galilee, especially the area around the Hula and the Jordan, the northern part of the Jordan. But the southern part of the Jordan leads from the Sea of Galilee into the Jordan. That's what's pathetic. It's beautiful just a kilometer south of that where there's a baptism site, and they widened it south at Qasr al Yahud near Jericho, where there's also the Jordan River is kind of widened into a reservoir to be like a nice baptism site for Christians who come. But other than that, it's a terrible trickle of itself, and we are working to rehabilitate that. It's really the only long-term solution to saving the Dead Sea and to hopefully reversing the weird geological sinkholes that have happened there as the Dead Sea shrinks and retreats. One of the solutions they're trying now is the Dead Red Canal and bringing seawater in, but they're worried about changing the hydrology. There's movement. It's too slow. It requires more concentrated government work to get water back into the southern Jordan, but it's slowly moving to happen, I would say.
Okay, this is slightly maybe a more politics question. Are you concerned that the extending of environmental regulation to the territories might create a conflict with Palestinians or with settlers?
Both, yes. It's a lose-lose. It's a win-win. It depends how you look at it. I honestly don't know the details of what's going on, but I can see, look, not to wade into it, but yeah, I mean, there's ways to use environmental policy to hem in Palestinian villages, and there are other ways to make sure, like to not regulate health hazards for Palestinians, like illegal landfills and pollution. So the regulation is something that would only benefit local population. I mean, the truth is we don't have a political stance on those questions. We're just trying to make sure that ecological, for example, the army doesn't, take up unnecessary, room in important ecological corridors. Because, Israel's a long, narrow country, and the big chunk that is the administered territories, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, is a huge chunk of that. And a lot of the ecological corridors we're trying to preserve run through there. So it's a step we feel we had to do. We're probably not going to succeed anyway. There's so many competing interests out there. It's going to be a long time, I think, before there's any environmental consideration.
Okay, so we have just a few more minutes, and I'm pretty sure we won't be able to answer all the questions, but how would you rank Israel in terms of environmental protection laws comparing to the rest of the world?
We lag behind I'd say we're not leading in the OECD. I mean, that's the only comparison. I mean, the rest of the world is not where the OECD countries are, the European and Western developed countries. We're not leading. We're okay. We're mostly compliant. And one of the problems is, I didn't mention actually, both Naftali Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar have come out in terms of a lot of deregulation of the economy in Israel. And to some extent, that may be deregulation of environmental laws, and we're keeping an eye on that as well. So that is a little bit of a cloud on the horizon of the government that might tackle environmental problems that I mentioned. But because there's a feeling in Israel that our environmental laws are too stringent, but that's not a feeling that's borne out by fact.
Okay. Is there something being done for light pollution for night birds and insects?
Yeah, it's in the discourse. We work on it. It's one of the things we work with businesses about. The Nature and Parks Authority, I think, has looked at it. We had a success we wrote about a few months ago. The National Water Carrier and all of its installations, Mekorot, the national water company in Israel, has changed all its lighting on the basis of a recommendation that we made to them, as an example. But yeah, it's in the discourse.
Okay, another quick one. Does Israel have any rat infestation like other major cities?
Rat infestation?
Yeah.
I mean, I see rats. We work our headquarters are in a pretty scuzzy part of Tel Aviv. And yeah, I see big fat rats that are, not scared of the cats, who are well fed by mostly women who go around and feed cats all the time. I've seen them in the subways in New York and in many cities. So yeah, no, but I don't know. I haven't heard of being a public health issue, no.
If the new government will be formed without the Orthodox Jews parties. Is there any hope of passing new laws that were blocked by them previously, like, for example, recycling of one-time use products and stuff like that?
That's a good question. I was wondering where that was going because, you know, they're not usually too concerned about the environment one way or the other, and they're not a typical blocker of environmental laws. And by the way, it's not the Orthodox, it's the ultra-Orthodox we're talking about because
Sorry, yeah.
the Orthodox are in this government under Bennett's party. No, I mean, I don't see there being, maybe it'll be easier to pass that. I think there has been movement on a bottle law to include all bottles, and I don't know, but recycling, it's a low hanging fruit on the hierarchy of waste, and we really need to produce less and use less, and everybody should have soda stream if they're having carbonated drinks, and we should just stop buying plastic bottles.
Perfect. One last question, even though I'm sorry we didn't cover all of them, but it's
I can stay a few minutes. I mean, people, there's still people on.
Okay, so let's do it quickly. Somebody's asking, and I think he has a point. If you say you're not a scientist, then why should we listen to your pontifications about climate change?
I mean, do you only read scientists about climate change? I mean, Jonathan Safran Foer and Naomi Wolf, these are not scientists. I mean, is this somebody who's doubting climate change? I don't want to, I mean, I'm not getting into a...
I don't know. I'm
not sure, but feel free to doubt what I said about climate change. But if you're part of the 2% of climate change doubters or deniers, I would recommend that you look at the other 98% of all scientific literature talking about the Anthropocene age and man's effect on climate. I'm not sure what that question is related to, but
okay. Are there any efforts made to using color blades on wind turbines to reduce bird strikes?
Again, I mentioned I'm not a scientist or a wind turbine designer, but I did mention that there are new designs coming out all the time that purport to be safer for birds. So there's hope on that horizon. I don't know about colored blades in particular.
Is there anything that us environmental professional in the US can do to help with lobbying in the Knesset or to improve the environmental practice in Israel?
I wonder, is that Ira that asked that?
How did you know?
Good question, Ira. In terms of the Knesset lobbying, I mean, if you come on a trip, we will hopefully have a meeting with a member of Knesset and your voice will be heard. No, I mean, other than that, I'm not exactly sure what you can do from abroad. And in terms of best practices, we're always looking to share best practices. I know Ira works in river management in Baltimore. So Ira, you have to come and talk to our river people. Yes, I don't have anything specific. We can put you in touch directly.
And one last question. How can we see Seaspiracy?
It's on Netflix. Seaspiracy is on Netflix. I mean, if you don't have Netflix, I don't know how. Maybe it's already pirated on YouTube or something, or parts of it or something, but it's a big Netflix phenomenon.
Perfect. So it can be watched on Netflix. And that's all for today, for tonight, and for this morning. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for all those great questions. I, enjoyed it. And everybody protect the environment when we can. And thank you for supporting us. And this webinar will be recorded. It will be online, like all of our webinars. I appreciate everybody's feedback here. And thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jay. The webinars are all on the natureisrael.org website or on the SPNI YouTube channel.
The mail that you all got when you signed up for this has a box to click on to see all our upcoming recorded webinars, and this will probably be online by tomorrow. So,
thank you very much, everybody. Have a great week.
Lila Tov, happy Mother's Day. Thank you all very much. Litrot.